What if the most beautiful palace ever constructed was actually the filthiest place in all of Europe? Versailles wasn't merely dirty. It was a biological nightmare, a place where 10,000 people lived with almost no toilets. In the hallways, nobles would urinate. Out of windows, servants dumped waste, and the stench could be detected from miles away. But here is the truth they really don't want you to know. Underneath those golden halls, there exists a sealed basement that French historians attempted to erase from history. And when they finally opened it, what they discovered changes everything. Picture the year 1682. A decision was made by Louis XIV, the Sun King, that would change European history forever. He moved his entire court, thousands of aristocrats, servants, officials, and hangers-on, to a palace constructed on swamp land 12 miles outside Paris. Versailles was not designed to house a city. It began as a hunting lodge, expanded over decades into a monument of ego and power. But what the paintings don't show you is this: up to 10,000 people were crammed into a building with virtually no plumbing, no sewage system, and no running water, except for the fountains in the gardens. The mathematical reality was both simple and devastating. Every single day, thousands of bodies produced waste with nowhere for it to go. Nobles who spent fortunes on silk gowns and diamond jewelry were forced to squat in corners like animals. The contrast was obscene. Golden ceilings above, human excrement below. With bizarre rules and desperate measures, the palace tried to maintain order. A decree was issued by Louis XIV himself that corridors must be cleaned of feces once per week. Just once per week. Think about that. It means the problem was so catastrophic that a weekly cleaning became official policy. An entire etiquette was developed by courtiers around avoiding the worst areas. Certain hallways, especially in the mornings, became known as no-go zones. The gardens, those legendary manicured masterpieces, doubled as open-air toilets after dark. Behind hedges and statues, visitors would lift their elaborate dresses or drop their breeches. Twice, Maria Antoinette herself was hit by the contents of chamber pots being dumped from windows above. After the second incident, a public notice declared it a criminal offense, which tells you how common it was. To try to catch offenders, the palace even stationed guards, but enforcement was impossible when everyone was doing it. What really shocks modern historians is this: the French court knew this was happening and simply accepted it as normal. Their entire social system was built around pretending the filth didn't exist. In rooms that reeked of urine, nobles would attend elaborate ceremonies, acting as if they smelled roses. The cognitive dissonance was staggering. Private letters were written by foreign dignitaries describing their horror, but French courtiers treated these visitors like unsophisticated peasants who couldn't handle real luxury. That people at Versailles relieved themselves openly in corners and courtyards was written by one German princess, and no one even blinked. But this casual acceptance was about to create something far worse than embarrassment. It was breeding a health crisis that would kill thousands. And to mask it, the perfume industry that rose would become one of the darkest economic success stories in history. Let's talk numbers, because the mathematics of the Versailles toilet crisis reveals just how insane this situation truly was. For 10,000 people, the palace had approximately 274 chamber pots and a handful of public latrines tucked under stairwells. Do the math. That's one toilet facility for every 36 people if everyone shared equally, which they absolutely did not. The royal family had private latrines, essentially wooden seats over holes connected to waste pipes that led to cesspits below. If they had the right keys, high-ranking nobles might have access to a shared latrine. Everyone else improvised. Luxury items became chamber pots. Among the wealthy, silver chamber pots were status symbols. But even with a pot, you still faced the problem of disposal. One of the worst jobs in human history belonged to servants called porteurs d'affaires. Carrying buckets of waste through the palace, they dumped them in designated areas. A nightmare of medieval engineering, the disposal system belonged in the Dark Ages, not the most advanced court in Europe. From the limited toilet facilities that existed, the cesspits beneath Versailles were supposed to collect waste. Seasonally, these pits were cleaned, which meant months of accumulation in underground chambers directly beneath the palace foundations. When it rained, the system overflowed. Through walls into adjacent rooms, waste would seep. There's a documented incident where the waste pipes above Marie Antoinette's kitchen broke and leaked for days, contaminating everything. The kitchen had to be completely gutted and rebuilt. Constantly, nobles whose apartments were near the cesspits complained about the smell, begging to be relocated. Rather than use the facilities near her rooms, the Princesse de Harcourt, known for her lack of shame, would urinate publicly because the stench was unbearable. Even the architects knew it was a disaster, but tearing apart the palace foundations would be required to fix it. What makes this even more disturbing is that solutions existed elsewhere in the world, but Versailles refused to adopt them. Sophisticated plumbing systems were had by the Ottoman Empire. For centuries, Chinese palaces had been using advanced sanitation. Even some English estates had better facilities. But their medieval approach was clung to by the French court. Partly from ignorance and partly from a twisted sense of superiority. They genuinely believed that their suffering through filth was a mark of civilization. That bathing and proper sanitation were for barbaric foreigners who didn't understand refinement. When the first flushing toilet was finally installed at Versailles in 1738 for Louis XV, it was treated as an exotic English curiosity, not the revolution it represented. For decades more, the rest of the court continued using chamber pots and hallway corners. This wasn't just a logistical failure. It was a cultural choice that transformed Versailles into a biological weapon against its own inhabitants. And the casualties were about to start piling up. Versailles wasn't just dirty. It was a petri dish for every disease known to 18th century medicine and plenty they couldn't identify. What courtiers politely called court fever was actually a rotating cast of dysentery, typhoid, and mysterious illnesses that swept through the palace in waves. During ceremonies, people collapsed. At breakfast, nobles would be vibrant and healthy, feverish by lunch, dead by midnight. To anyone willing to see it, the connection to sanitation was obvious. But admitting the palace was killing its inhabitants would mean admitting the entire system was a failure. So elaborate explanations were invented by court physicians. Bad air from the marshes, planetary alignments, imbalances of humors in the blood, anything except the truth, which was that thousands of people were living in close quarters with their own waste and drinking water contaminated by overflowing cesspits. By modern doctors who've studied the historical records, the death rates among servants and lower-ranking courtiers are horrified by. Everything about Versailles priorities is told by the class divide in disease and death. High-ranking nobles who had better apartments away from the worst sanitation disasters still got sick regularly but survived more often. In alarming numbers, servants who slept in cramped quarters near the cesspits and handled waste directly died. But their deaths weren't recorded with the same detail as noble deaths. So the true casualty count is lost to history. What we do know is chilling. Repeatedly, smallpox epidemics tore through the palace. So common among the nobility was syphilis that wigs became fashionable partly to hide the baldness it caused. Universal were lice infestations. Because everyone just accepted that their heads would be crawling with insects, nobles would use jeweled scratchers, decorative sticks designed to reach under wigs and relieve itching. That you could tell someone's rank by the quality of their scratcher was written by one courtier, which is possibly the most depressing status symbol in human history. Here's what really reveals the madness of Versailles. They knew the palace was making people sick. Reports were written by court physicians documenting the connection between sanitation and disease. Citing health concerns, some nobles begged to leave. But a system had been created by Louis XIV where presence at Versailles equaled political power. If you left, you lost influence, patronage, access to the king. So nobles stayed, risking their lives and their children's lives for a chance to watch the king eat breakfast. Catastrophic was the mortality rate for infants born at Versailles. From preventable illnesses directly linked to the unsanitary conditions, children of nobles died regularly. And still no one admitted the truth. Instead, France decided to solve the problem the only way they knew how. They would mask it, hide it, bury it under so much perfume that no one could smell the rot anymore. And an industry was created by that decision that would define French culture for centuries. Built entirely on covering up the stench of death. The modern equivalent of $2 million per year was spent by France on perfume at Versailles. 2 million. That's not a typo. This wasn't luxury. This was crisis management on an industrial scale. The primary customer for every perfume maker in France became the palace. And to meet demand, new ones opened constantly. Shipped from the Ottoman Empire was Bulgarian rose water. At prices that would make modern luxury brands blush was Arabian amber. Indian sandalwood, Spanish orange blossom, Italian bergamot. If it smelled good and came from anywhere in the known world, it was bought by Versailles by the barrel. Staggering was the economic impact. The wealthiest craftsmen in Europe became French perfumers. They opened boutiques that served the nobility, created signature scents for individual courtiers, and pioneered distillation techniques that are still used today. But on a foundation of human waste and corpse smell, this entire industry, this pillar of French culture, was built. More complex than some military operations were the perfume protocols at Versailles. Fresh flowers weren't just placed in vases. Every 2 hours around the clock, they were replaced, requiring a rotating staff of servants carrying armfuls of roses, lavender, and jasmine through every corridor. Into furniture, scented oils were rubbed, dripped onto candles, mixed into the mortar between stones. Scent machines were developed by the palace, perforated boxes that burned aromatic pellets to spread perfumed smoke through rooms. These devices were works of art created by the finest craftsmen, but their purpose was purely functional. They were trying to fight biology with botany. A system of scented handkerchiefs, pomanders, and perfumed gloves was developed by courtiers that they would press to their noses when the smell became unbearable. Carrying a pomander, a decorative ball filled with cloves, cinnamon, and dried flowers, was considered essential. Not optional, essential. If you showed up without one, people assumed you were either stupid or had no sense of smell. But here's the cruel irony that nobody talks about. All that perfume made things worse. The human nose can adapt to consistent smells, even bad ones. But when you layer heavy floral scents over the stench of human waste, you create a nauseating mixture that's actually harder to tolerate. As trying to breathe through sweet-smelling poison, it was described by visitors. That the combination of decomposing organic matter and overwhelming floral perfume created a smell that was almost psychedelic in its intensity was noted by one historian, a sensory assault that made people dizzy and disoriented. Its own unique stench had essentially been created by the palace, something that existed nowhere else on earth. And courtiers who spent years there became so desensitized that they genuinely couldn't understand why foreign ambassadors were gagging and fleeing. This disconnect between the French court's perception and reality was about to cause an international diplomatic crisis that would damage France's reputation for decades. Like horror movie reviews read the diplomatic letters from foreign ambassadors visiting Versailles. These weren't crude peasants or unsophisticated provincials. These were men who traveled Europe, visited other royal courts, seen their share of pre-modern sanitation, and they were appalled. In coded language, a Spanish ambassador wrote that the French king's palace carried the stench of a battlefield 3 days after combat. Let that sink in. He compared it to rotting corpses under the summer sun. That all future meetings be held outdoors was formally requested by an English envoy, citing health concerns, not inconvenience, health. He was genuinely worried the palace would make him sick, and he wasn't wrong. From 50 feet away, a German visitor described an overwhelming presence that made his eyes water. These men were diplomats trained to be polite and tactful. If they were writing things this blunt in private letters, imagine how bad it really was. After their first visit, some ambassadors simply refused to enter the palace. They would send junior diplomats, essentially condemning younger men to suffer through meetings because they themselves couldn't handle it. There's a documented case of a Venetian ambassador who attended one formal dinner at Versailles and then claimed urgent business in Italy, fleeing the country rather than face another meal in that environment. A pattern began to be noticed by foreign courts. Diplomats sent to Versailles would return weeks or months later looking ill, having lost weight, sometimes showing signs of actual disease. What we now recognize as trauma responses were developed by some, refusing to discuss their time at the palace in any detail. That the French king smelled worse than his horse and moved like a heavily pregnant woman was written by one Russian diplomat. This wasn't just an insult. It was an observation that the most powerful monarch in Europe was physically repulsive to be near. Desperately, the French government tried to suppress these accounts. They pressured foreign courts to discipline diplomats who wrote too honestly about Versailles. They spread counter-narratives claiming that visitors were simply unsophisticated or jealous of French grandeur. But the letters kept coming and they kept telling the same story. Versailles was unbearable. Actually, international relations suffered because of the palace's stench. Just through letters instead, some smaller nations simply stopped sending permanent ambassadors to France, conducting their diplomatic business. Because foreign merchants wanted to leave as quickly as possible, trade negotiations were rushed. France's cultural prestige, the idea that they represented the pinnacle of European civilization, began to crack. And here's what makes this even more tragic. While France was losing diplomatic credibility and making visitors physically ill, the worst was yet to come. Because summer at Versailles turned the nightmare up to levels that seem almost fictional. Every June, Versailles transformed from a barely tolerable nightmare into something approaching hell on earth. Exponentially, heat amplified every smell. Under the summer sun, the cesspits that simmered underground all winter would reach boiling point, releasing gases that seeped up through the palace floors. Literally, the waste that accumulated in corners and courtyards would cook, creating a miasma that hung over everything. Often for winter, foreign visitors who'd heard the stories scheduled their trips, specifically to avoid the summer horror. Universally, those who came in July or August regretted it. That the smell of Versailles in summer could be detected from the road 2 miles away before you could even see the palace was written by one visitor. A test of endurance became approaching Versailles in the heat, watching that golden building grow larger while the stench grew stronger, wondering how close you could get before your body forced you to turn back. A tradition called the summer evacuation was developed by the French court. It wasn't officially called that, but everyone knew what it was. Every noble who could afford to leave would invent reasons to visit their country estate starting in May. By half, the palace population would drop by mid-June. By August, only those who absolutely had to stay remained. The king and his immediate family, servants who had no choice, and the most desperate social climbers who would endure anything for proximity to power. Whenever possible, the king himself would retreat to other palaces like Marly or Fontainebleau. Though he couldn't admit that the palace he'd built as a monument to his glory was uninhabitable 4 months a year. In brutal conditions, servants who stayed behind worked. Just to breathe, some would tie perfumed cloths over their faces. What they called summer fever was developed by others, which was probably a combination of dehydration, heat exhaustion, and illness from exposure to decomposing waste. The worst incidents happened when summer storms hit without warning. The primitive drainage systems would be overwhelmed by rain, sending floods of contaminated water through the palace. Ankle deep in a mixture of rainwater and sewage, courtiers would wake to find their rooms. The smell during these floods was described by one witness as beyond description, beyond any natural scent, something that seemed designed to drive humans insane. Their apartments would be fled by nobles, sometimes abandoning expensive furniture and clothing rather than spend another minute in those conditions. For days, cleanup crews would work, but the smell would linger for weeks, absorbed into the walls and tapestries. And through it all, its public facade was maintained by the palace. The floods or the evacuations are rarely mentioned in official records. From that era, paintings show elegant courtiers in beautiful gardens, never the reality of people fleeing a biological disaster. But there was one area even worse than the summer-flooded apartments. A place that nobles genuinely feared to approach even in winter. And that place was about to become central to the darkest secret Versailles never wanted revealed. A labyrinth lay beneath the golden halls of Versailles that the French court tried very hard to make everyone forget existed. The basement level wasn't a single room, but a network of corridors, storage areas, and most critically, the collection points where all the waste from the upper palace eventually accumulated. This wasn't part of any public tour. Most courtiers never went down there, and servants who worked those areas were considered the lowest of the low, essentially untouchables in the palace hierarchy. The night shift was what the basement workers were called, not because they worked at night, but because they operated in permanent darkness. The few descriptions that survive are nightmarish. Tunnels barely tall enough to stand in. Air so thick with methane and ammonia that candles would flicker and die. And the waste, mountains of it, decades of accumulated human excrement, rotting food, dead animals, and God knows what else, all festering in chambers that were supposed to be temporary storage but had become permanent dumps because the system was overwhelmed from day one. Their own protocols and survival strategies were developed by these basement workers. Their faces would be coated with animal fat mixed with strong herbs, creating a barrier between their skin and the toxic air. In short shifts, they worked because longer exposure would cause vomiting, dizziness, and sometimes fainting. The most experienced workers could navigate the tunnels by feel and near darkness, knowing which areas were stable and which might collapse under the weight of accumulated waste above. There are records of workers simply disappearing down there, presumably overcome by gases or trapped by cave-ins. Their bodies were never recovered because no one wanted to search those depths. Relatively well by servant standards, the palace paid these workers. But the mortality rate was so high that it became a job for the truly desperate, men with gambling debts, criminals offered this work instead of prison, or immigrants who had no other options. Here's where it gets truly disturbing. Parts of the Versailles basement were eventually sealed off completely. Not cleaned, sealed. When sections became so contaminated that even the night workers refused to enter them, the palace would simply brick up the entrances and pretend those areas didn't exist. That the accumulated waste was producing gases that were causing structural damage and creating explosion risks was realized by engineers. Yes, explosion risks. Methane buildup from decomposing organic matter reached levels where a single spark could potentially blow holes in the palace foundation. So, they sealed the worst sections, creating tombs of human waste directly beneath one of the world's most famous buildings. Some of these sealed sections remain closed to this day. Areas in the basement that have never been opened since the 18th century have been identified by modern structural engineers who've surveyed Versailles. And there's significant debate about whether they ever should be. Which brings us to the discovery that changed everything. For over 300 years, the truth about Versailles was successfully buried by France. About the Hall of Mirrors and the gardens, schoolchildren learned, never about the rivers of sewage. Elegant ceremonies were described by tour guides, never the nobles squatting in corners. So carefully constructed was the official narrative that even historians who suspected the truth had trouble finding solid evidence. But in the late 20th century, something changed. Major restoration work was undergone by Versailles, and modern engineers needed to survey the entire structure, including areas that hadn't been opened in centuries. What they found was staggering. In the sealed basement sections, they discovered layers of fossilized waste compressed over decades. Like an archaeological dig was the stratification. Each layer representing a different era of the palace's occupation. Exactly what everyone had been living above was revealed by chemical analysis. Human excrement, yes, but also evidence of every disease that had plagued the palace. Preserved in the dried waste like a medical horror museum were traces of smallpox, typhoid, and other killers. Even worse than historical accounts suggested was the infrastructure they uncovered. Waste pipes that had never been properly connected. Cesspits that had overflowed so many times the ground around them was permanently contaminated. Evidence of desperate, failed attempts to address the crisis, like improvised drainage channels that just redirected waste from one area to another. Damning were the engineering reports. This wasn't a palace with a sanitation problem. This was a sanitation catastrophe that happened to have a palace built on top of it. But here's where it gets controversial. Immediately, French historians and cultural officials began debating what to do with this information. A UNESCO World Heritage Site is Versailles. It's a source of national pride and a major tourist attraction, bringing in millions of visitors and billions of dollars. Revealing the full extent of its filth problem could damage that carefully maintained image. So, what did they do? They released some information, enough to seem transparent, but kept the worst discoveries quiet. Today, an ongoing debate exists in academic circles about how much the public deserves to know. That the full truth should be revealed is argued by some historians, that understanding the reality of palace life is crucial to understanding history accurately. That focusing on the filth diminishes the artistic and cultural achievements of Versailles is claimed by others, that tourists don't need to know every grotesque detail. But here's what can't be denied. The divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were chosen by God and therefore superior to ordinary humans, required those ordinary humans to literally live in their own waste just to be near power. While squatting in hallways, nobles bankrupted themselves buying jewels and silk. So the king could pretend he ruled from heaven on earth, servants died young from preventable diseases. The grandeur was real, but it was built on a foundation of human suffering and waste that they then spent 3 centuries trying to hide. A lie so enormous was Versailles that it required millions in perfume and hundreds of years of cover-up to maintain. If this story disturbed you, if it changed how you see Versailles and the so-called glory of absolute monarchy, you need to subscribe to this channel right now. These are the histories they don't want you to know. The secrets buried under centuries of propaganda and tourist brochures. Drop a comment below telling me what shocked you most. Was it the sealed basement, the disease crisis, or the $2 million perfume budget? And smash that like button because YouTube needs to know people want real history, not sanitized fairy tales. Dozens more secrets like this are waiting to be exposed from other royal courts, from famous historical events, from people you thought you knew. I'm bringing them all to light, one buried truth at a time. So subscribe, turn on notifications, and get ready because the real history is always more disturbing than they taught you in school. The most damning evidence wasn't just in the waste itself, but in what was found mixed with it. Preserved in that foul, stratified record were the tragic remnants of daily life at court. The archaeologists and chemists analyzing the sealed basements found something they didn't initially understand, a shocking concentration of heavy metals, particularly lead and arsenic. At first, they assumed it was from the plumbing or the building materials. But the levels were too high, too consistent with the organic layers. The truth was more insidious. The lead was coming from the very tools of aristocracy. The wine they drank was sweetened and preserved in lead-lined vessels. The makeup they slathered on their faces, the white powder and rouge that made them look fashionably pale, was loaded with lead and mercury. The medicinal potions prescribed by court physicians to treat the summer fever, or melancholy, often contained arsenic. Versailles wasn't just poisoning its inhabitants with filth and disease, it was slowly poisoning them with their own vanity and their doctors' ignorance. The mysterious illnesses that caused nobles to waste away, suffer from gout, or descend into madness now had a new, terrifying explanation. The palace was a multivector toxic environment. This changes the entire narrative of power. We often picture Louis XIV and his successors as all-powerful, divine monarchs. The reality, hidden in the basement strata, is that they were as vulnerable as anyone else. The Sun King himself suffered from agonizing gout, likely exacerbated by lead-contaminated wine and food. The erratic behavior and poor health of later monarchs and courtiers can now be re-examined through this lens of constant, low-level heavy metal poisoning. The sealed basement didn't just contain waste, it contained the physical proof that the entire French court was trapped in a feedback loop of its own creation. The perfume was meant to cover the stench of sewage, but it also masked the sweet, metallic smell of lead-based cosmetics. The elaborate wigs hid the baldness from syphilis, but also perhaps the hair loss from arsenic poisoning. Every solution was a veneer that added another layer of toxicity. And this brings us to the final, darkest secret the French authorities still struggle with. The restoration team made another discovery in the deepest, most securely sealed section of the basement, a mass grave. It wasn't a formal cemetery. It was a haphazard pit, filled with skeletons, dozens of them, all jumbled together. Forensic analysis revealed they were almost certainly servants, the night shift. The bones showed signs of chronic malnutrition, spinal deformities from backbreaking labor, and residues of the same heavy metals found in the waste. But the cause of death for many was acute, trauma from cave-ins, or asphyxiation from methane gas. The official palace records from the era mentioned servants, of course, but their deaths were noted as brief, administrative footnotes, if at all. So-and-so, servant, dismissed. Such-and-such, laborer, replaced. The pit in the basement tells the real story. These men weren't dismissed, they were worked to death in a toxic hellscape and then unceremoniously dumped in the very filth that killed them, their disappearance a convenient administrative cleanup. This is the truth that is perhaps the most difficult to reconcile with Versailles' image. The grandeur was not just built on human suffering, it was periodically cleansed by it. The system consumed the lives of its most vulnerable to maintain the illusion of divine perfection above. So, the next time you see a painting of a radiant Louis XIV presiding over his court in the Hall of Mirrors, remember what lies beneath. See not just the power, but the gout-ridden feet swollen with pain. Smell not just the perfume, but the nauseating cocktail of roses and human decay. See the servants not as silent props, but as doomed souls whose bones are still entombed in the darkness below. Versailles stands today as a monument to two things, the breathtaking heights of human artistry and the shocking depths of human self-deception. It is a palace where the walls don't just talk, they whisper secrets of poison, perfume, and the countless lives sacrificed to maintain a beautiful, glorious, and utterly filthy lie. The history you were taught was polished and perfumed for public consumption. But the real history, the one buried in the stone and the soil, is waiting for those willing to dig for it. This channel is your shovel. Subscribe now, because we're just getting started.